Amid the rigid routine of an executive, the silence of loneliness was his only constant companion. But everything changed when a child appeared. Determined to save his sick mother's job, the simple gesture revealed a strength he had forgotten existed, and for the first time in years, he felt something that could not be measured in numbers: humanity. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's begin. The shrill sound of the alarm clock echoed through the rooms of the spacious apartment on Fifth Avenue, breaking the silence of the New York City dawn. 5:30 in the morning, a religiously respected time when Anthony Miller began his daily ritual, never allowing himself the luxury of a few more minutes of sleep. For him, every wasted minute was money lost, and money had always been his measure of success. At 45 years old, Anthony had achieved what many would consider the top of the American business world. As the owner of Miller Holdings, one of New York City's most prosperous construction companies, responsible for erecting some of the most imposing buildings in the nation's financial capital, he boasted not only material wealth, but also influence in circles of power. With precise and calculated movements, he rose from the king-size bed, which he had occupied alone for years. Solitude did not bother him. In fact, he cultivated it, considering it essential to maintain focus on his objectives. With meticulous attention to detail, he made the bed with almost military precision, smoothing every wrinkle of the Egyptian cotton sheets that cost the equivalent of many of his employees' monthly salaries. He headed to the spacious bathroom of his triplex penthouse, where an electronically temperature-controlled shower awaited him. His reflection in the immense illuminated mirror showed a man of average height but with an imposing presence. His hard features, carved by years of ruthless negotiations, were framed by impeccably cut hair, already with visible grey streaks at the temples which, far from diminishing his attractiveness, gave him an air of experience and authority. His penetrating brown eyes rarely softened into a genuine smile, a luxury he considered unnecessary in the competitive business world. After his shower, he put on a custom-made Italian suit in a shade of navy blue that enhanced his naturally tanned skin. A silk tie in a darker shade completed the successful executive's look. His gestures were economical and precise. There was no room for hesitation or doubt in his life. Breakfast was already served when he descended to the dining room, punctually at 6 o'clock. The black marble table was set to perfection: French porcelain china, polished silver cutlery, and linen napkins folded into an elegant shape. Mary, the housekeeper who had worked for him for 10 years, never dared to be late or absent, even when her teenage son fell ill, or when the city's typical floods made the 2-hour commute from her home in East Queens to her boss's apartment almost impossible. Everyone knew that punctuality was the minimum Anthony demanded. "Good morning, sir," Mary said, pouring coffee into a delicate porcelain cup while keeping her eyes downcast, as she had learned to do over the years. "Do you prefer poached or scrambled eggs today?" Anthony merely nodded in minimal acknowledgement, without taking his eyes off the tablet, where he was reading financial market news and quotes that would define his strategies for the day. "Poached," he replied dryly. For him, unnecessary conversations were a waste of time, and time, in his philosophy, was the most precious asset, as long as it was converted into productivity and profit. As he ate methodically, he mentally reviewed the day's agenda: a meeting with investors at 9, a business lunch with a potential client at 12:30, a conference call with international partners at 4 in the afternoon. Another perfectly planned day with no room for unforeseen events or, God forbid, emotions. Personal life? That was something he had set aside long ago, considering it a luxury for the weak, for those who lacked the willpower necessary to achieve excellence. Since his divorce 10 years ago, he had dedicated himself exclusively to work. His ex-wife, Martha, a talented and sensitive architect, had given up on him after 5 years of trying to compete with his obsession with work. "You don't love a person, Anthony. You own them like another one of your trophies," were her last words before she walked out the door, leaving behind not only a marriage, but the possibility of a family that never materialized. That memory, however, rarely surfaced in Anthony's disciplined mind. He had filed it away with other failures he preferred not to revisit. If he ever missed human warmth, the comfort of an embrace, or the complicity of a sincere conversation, He never admitted it, not even to himself. Relationships, in his pragmatic view of the world, were high-risk, low-return emotional investments. At precisely 7 o'clock, his driver, Sebastian, was already waiting for him in the building's garage with the meticulously cleaned and polished black Audi A8. The drive to the company headquarters, located in a modern business complex in Midtown Manhattan, was made in almost religious silence. Sebastian, after years of working for Anthony, knew that his boss preferred to use this time to mentally review his agenda and plan the day, without being disturbed by attempts at conversation or the sound of the radio. The only permitted noise was the occasional ring of his cell phone, reserved exclusively for calls of extreme importance. As the car navigated the chaotic traffic of the largest American metropolis, Anthony observed through the window, with a mixture of pride and detachment, the buildings his company had constructed over the past 20 years. Miller Holdings had started as a small construction company focused on mid-range residences, inherited from his father. Under his relentless command, it had transformed into an empire that dominated the market for corporate skyscrapers and high-end luxury condominiums. Each building was a monument to his vision of success and power, cold, impersonal, imposing. The driver skillfully maneuvered through the congested streets as raindrops began to dot the windshield. A fine, steady rain, typical of that New York autumn, which transformed the city's usual grey into an even darker and more melancholic shade. For Anthony, however, the weather was just another factor to be considered in his daily calculations. It might delay material deliveries on some construction sites, perhaps impact the schedule of one or another project. Nothing an efficient leader couldn't circumvent with appropriate measures. Upon arriving at the imposing headquarters of Miller Holdings, a glass and steel building that reflected New York City's grey sky like a gigantic mirror, Anthony was greeted with the reverence his position commanded. The reception security guard immediately straightened upon seeing him, nodding respectfully. The receptionist, a young woman impeccably dressed and made up, despite the early hour, offered a professional smile as she formally greeted him. All employees knew exactly how to behave in the boss's presence. No one dared to smile too much, speak loudly, or show any sign of casualness when he passed. The atmosphere became heavy, as if the air was harder to breathe. Fear was the predominant feeling in that place, a fear carefully cultivated by Anthony, who firmly believed that this was how discipline was maintained and excellence achieved. As he walked down the main corridor towards the exclusive elevator that would take him directly to the top floor, where his office was located, Anthony noticed how conversations abruptly ceased, how smiles disappeared and were replaced by serious and tense expressions, how people avoided his gaze while murmuring respectful, "Good morning, Mr. Miller." Far from bothering him, this effect he caused gave him a sense of control that he appreciated. The private elevator, accessible only via a special magnetic card, was another symbol of his status within the company. As he ascended the 20 floors at an impressive speed, Anthony admired the panoramic view of the city through the elevator's glass walls, a concrete and steel jungle that, in a way, reflected his own personality, imposing, inflexible, pragmatic. Upon reaching his floor, he was greeted by Regina, his executive assistant, a competent and discreet middle-aged woman who had survived for over a decade under Anthony's rigorous command. Regina was one of the few people who could anticipate his needs and deal with his demanding temperament without succumbing to stress or tears, as had happened with so many predecessors. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Regina greeted, rising respectfully from her desk. She wore a sober and discreet navy blue pantsuit, with light makeup and her hair pulled back in an impeccable bun, the perfect image of a professional who knew her place and valued efficiency above all else. "The meeting with investors is confirmed for 9 o'clock. All reports are already printed and organized as you requested. Mr. Mason from JRM Investments called to confirm his presence, as did the representatives of the Arab Fund. The coffee in the meeting room has been prepared exactly as you prefer." She spoke in an efficient tone, without circumlocution or superfluous information, exactly as Anthony had trained his team over the years. Time was money, and unnecessary words were therefore a financial waste. "Excellent," he replied dryly as he entered his office. I don't want to be interrupted until the meeting. Please ensure that the updated numbers for the Golden Coast project are included in the presentation. And cancel lunch with Rivers. He's trying to renegotiate the land contract in Greenwich, and I'm not willing to concede an inch. Regina made quick notes on her tablet, nodding efficiently. Yes, sir. Anything else? Not for now. Let me know when the investors arrive. With an almost imperceptible nod, Regina silently withdrew, closing the door. Behind her, Anthony was alone in his personal domain, a space that perfectly reflected his philosophy of life. Anthony's office was large, occupying almost half of the floor, with a panoramic view of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a meticulously organized environment, with modern, minimalist furniture in shades of grey, black and white. The enormous glass and steel desk, strategically positioned so that his back was to the window, which forced visitors to face the light and, consequently, be at a psychological disadvantage during negotiations, was impeccably tidy. Documents in folders identified by color and subject, a state-of-the-art laptop precisely aligned with the edge of the desk, a pen holder containing only premium brand writing instruments. As he prepared for the meeting, he heard a noise in the corridor. It was unusual, as everyone knew they should maintain silence on that floor. Annoyed, he opened the door to check what was happening. "Has Mrs. Irene not come in again today?" His secretary's voice sounded concerned. "No, Mrs. Regina. She's had a high fever since yesterday," replied Zoe, another cleaning staff member, with evident concern. "The doctor at the local clinic said she needs to stay in bed for a few days." Anthony frowned. Mrs. Irene was responsible for cleaning his floor. It was the second time that month she had been absent. For him, regardless of the reason, it was unacceptable. The company could not stop because of an employee's personal problems. "Regina, I want HR to arrange a replacement for Mrs. Irene immediately," he ordered, interrupting the conversation, "and prepare the documents for her dismissal. We cannot keep employees who do not fulfill their obligations." Regina hesitated for a moment, but she knew her boss well enough to know that arguing would be useless. "Sir, Mrs. Irene has worked with us for 8 years and has never caused problems before. She is genuinely ill and it seems to be serious this time." "That's not my problem," Anthony cut in. "If she can't work, we'll find someone who can." End of discussion. He returned to his office, closing the door with a little more force than necessary. For him, rules were rules. Feelings had no place in the business world. Employees like Mrs. Irene were easily replaceable, cogs in a machine that needed to function perfectly every day. The morning continued with the investors' meeting, where Anthony, as always, impressed everyone with his strategic vision and mastery of numbers. Miller Holdings was about to embark on a major project on the Hamptons coast, a luxury resort that promised to be the most sophisticated in the region. The investors were excited, and Anthony knew exactly how to keep them that way. After the meeting, satisfied with the results, he decided to check if HR had already arranged Mrs. Irene's replacement. He needed to ensure his office and the entire floor were impeccable for an important visit from international clients the following afternoon. As he walked down the corridor, something unusual caught his attention. A small figure, with her back to him, was trying to maneuver a bucket and a mop almost her size. For a moment, Anthony thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. It was a child. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, wore an oversized T-shirt for her slender body and held a pair of rubber gloves that covered her arms almost up to her elbows. Her hair, tied in 2 braids, swayed as she tried to push the cleaning cart to the next office. "What is the meaning of this?" Anthony's voice came out louder than he intended, making the small figure jump in fright and quickly turn around. The eyes that met his were large and expressive, a deep brown that resembled chocolate. Despite the fright, there was no fear in them, only sincere curiosity and something Anthony couldn't immediately identify. Determination, perhaps. "Good morning, sir," the child replied in a soft, polite voice. "I'm Julia, Mrs. Irene's daughter. I came to work in my mom's place because she's sick." Anthony was momentarily speechless, a rare occurrence in his life. He felt a mixture of indignation and perplexity. How could a child be there trying to do an adult's job? And worse, how had the security guards allowed her into the building? "Where's Regina?" he asked, still processing the situation. "The lady at the big desk," She went to get some coffee, Julia replied, adjusting the gloves that insisted on slipping from her small hands. I told her I knew how to clean. I help my mom at home every day. At that moment, Regina returned, and upon seeing the scene, her face paled. Mr. Miller, I can explain, she began nervously. She appeared at reception saying she was Mrs. Irene's daughter and had come to work in her mother's place. I was trying to contact HR to resolve the situation when I went to get some coffee for her. Anthony raised his hand, interrupting his secretary's explanation. He looked again at the girl, who was observing him with impressive seriousness for someone so young. Julia, isn't it? He asked, trying to soften his usual tone. How old are you? 6.5, she replied, puffing out her chest with pride. My birthday was last month. 6 years old. The age hit Anthony like a punch. A 6-year-old child had taken public transport alone to get there, determined to work in place of her sick mother. The idea was so absurd that he could barely process it. And does your mother know you're here? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. Julia lowered her eyes for the first time, fiddling with the end of one of her braids. No, sir. She was asleep when I left. I left a note saying I was going to help her not lose her job. Something strange happened inside Anthony at that moment. An unknown sensation, as if something was moving in his chest, breaking a hard shell that had formed over the years. He looked at that child, so small and so determined, and for the first time in a long time he felt disarmed. Regina, call Mrs. Irene and inform her that her daughter is here, he ordered, maintaining his composure, and arrange a taxi to take her back home immediately. But what about the work, sir? Julia asked with genuine concern in her childish voice. My mom needs the job. We need the money for her medicine. The girl's words affected Anthony in a way he didn't expect. Medicine. A sick employee who couldn't afford her own treatment, and a child willing to work to help. That seemed so distant from the reality he lived in, where financial problems were just numbers on a spreadsheet. Don't worry about that now, he replied, trying to keep his tone firm but failing slightly. Your mother won't lose her job. Julia's eyes lit up with such pure hope that for a moment Anthony felt ashamed to have considered firing Mrs. Irene. Promise? She asked, extending her pinky finger towards him. Anthony looked at that small extended finger, an invitation to a childish promise he hadn't made since, well, he couldn't even remember the last time. He hesitated, feeling ridiculous, but something about that child prevented him from simply ignoring the gesture. To Regina's surprise, who was watching the scene open-mouthed, Anthony Miller, the feared CEO of Miller Holdings, extended his pinky finger and intertwined it with Julia's. I promise, he said, feeling strangely committed to those words. The smile he received in return made something stir within him again. It was a smile without ulterior motives, without expectations of gain or manipulation. It was pure childish joy, something he hadn't seen or perhaps hadn't noticed for a long time. While Regina organized Julia's return home, Anthony went back to his office, trying to resume his work rhythm. But something had changed. For the first time in years, he couldn't concentrate. The image of that 6-year-old girl with huge gloves and a bucket almost her size wouldn't leave his mind. He tried to review contracts, answer emails, but the question wouldn't leave him in peace. What kind of circumstances would lead such a small child to feel the need to work in her mother's place? Without much thought, he picked up the phone and called HR. I want Mrs. Irene's address, he requested, surprising the attendant. And no, it's not to send a dismissal letter. It's a personal matter. Upon receiving the address, Anthony looked out his office window at New York City sprawling below. The skyscrapers, the traffic, the pollution. Suddenly, that entire vision of success and power seemed strangely empty. At the end of the afternoon, after concluding his scheduled meetings, Anthony informed Regina that he would be leaving early and was not available for calls unless it was an absolute emergency. His secretary tried to hide her surprise. In all her years working for him, she had never seen him leave before 8 in the evening. Anthony asked his driver to take him to Mrs. Irene's address in East Queens. As the car crossed the city, he watched the urban landscape gradually change. The imposing buildings of the financial center gave way to simpler constructions, less well-maintained streets, a reality very different from his own. Something inside him said that this visit was not just about Mrs. Irene or her daughter. It was about something he had been ignoring for a long time. Something that in some way that 6-year-old girl, with her courage and determination, had awakened. When the car stopped in front of a small townhouse in a narrow alley, Anthony felt a hesitation. What exactly was he doing there? What would he say? Why did he care? These questions tormented him as he stepped out of the vehicle, attracting curious glances from residents unaccustomed to seeing luxury cars in that area. Standing in front of the simple house, with peeling paint and a small garden cared for despite its modesty, Anthony Miller, the man who commanded an empire, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: uncertainty. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. "Who is it?" A faint woman's voice sounded from inside the house. "Anthony Miller, from the construction company," he replied, noticing that his voice sounded less confident than usual. There was a moment of silence, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. The door opened, revealing not Mrs. Irene but Julia with wide eyes of surprise. "It's the promise man," she exclaimed, turning back into the house. "Mom, it's the man who promised you wouldn't lose your job." And so, without knowing exactly why, Anthony Miller entered Mrs. Irene's humble home, feeling that something fundamental in his life was about to change. The journey that had begun with the simple decision to dismiss an absent employee now led him to unknown territory, where the rules that had guided his life until then suddenly seemed insufficient. The small house was modest, but extraordinarily clean and organized. Anthony immediately noticed the contrast between the simplicity of the furniture and the care with which everything was arranged. A wooden table with 4 chairs, a worn sofa, some plants in makeshift pots, and on the walls, photographs of Julia at different ages. "Please come in," Julia said, pulling him by the hand as if they were old acquaintances. "My mum is in the bedroom. She's sick, but she got very worried when I came back and told her I had gone to work in her place." Anthony allowed himself to be guided, feeling strangely out of place in that environment. He was accustomed to imposing his presence, to dominating any space he entered. There, in that small living room, he felt like an intruder. The bedroom door was ajar. Mrs. Irene was sitting on the bed, propped up by pillows, with a pale complexion that betrayed her condition. Upon seeing Anthony, her eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Mr. Miller," she exclaimed, trying to adjust herself. "I'm sorry for not getting up. Don't worry," Anthony interrupted with a gesture that tried to be reassuring. "I just came to check on you and talk about the situation." Mrs. Irene cast a worried glance at Julia, who was observing the scene with childish curiosity. "Daughter, why don't you go make that orange juice you know how to make for Mr. Miller?" she suggested, in an evident attempt to remove the child from the conversation that would follow. Julia hesitated, looking from her mother to Anthony, but eventually agreed. Before leaving, she held Anthony's hand again and said seriously, "You promised my mum wouldn't lose her job. A promise is a promise, okay?" The sincerity of those words touched Anthony in a way he didn't expect. He nodded in silence, and Julia, satisfied with the confirmation, skipped off towards the kitchen. An uncomfortable silence hung in the room for a few moments. Mrs. Irene seemed to be gathering courage to speak, while Anthony observed the details of the environment. The room was simple, like the rest of the house, but there were small touches that revealed care and affection. A vase with flowers by the bed, children's books stacked on a chair, drawings made by Julia pinned to the wall. "Mr. Miller," Mrs. Irene finally began, her voice trembling, "I wanted to apologize for Julia going to the company. I was sleeping because of the medication and didn't realize when she left. When the taxi arrived with her, I almost fainted from worry." Anthony, who would normally interrupt such an explanation with impatience, found himself listening attentively. Mrs. Irene's face showed not only the concern of someone who fears losing their job, but primarily the anguish of a mother. "Julia told me you're sick," he commented, trying to maintain a neutral tone, though something inside him was restless. "Is it serious?" Mrs. Irene lowered her eyes, clutching the sheet between her fingers. "Pneumonia, sir. The doctor at the clinic said I need to rest and take antibiotics. But I didn't want to miss work. I know how demanding you are." The last word came out as a euphemism, and Anthony knew it. At the company, his reputation was that of a ruthless man who tolerated no failures or absences, regardless of the reasons. "And why aren't you in the hospital?" he asked, noticing how difficult her breathing seemed. A sad smile passed over Mrs. Irene's lips. "The public hospital is crowded, sir. I waited almost 10 hours in the emergency room line to be seen, and then they sent me home with a prescription. They said they only admit the most serious cases." Anthony felt something uncomfortable grow within him. In his world, health problems were solved with a call to a private doctor, with private rooms in top hospitals. Mrs. Irene's reality was a parallel universe that he knew existed, but had never truly considered. "And the medications? Are you able to buy them?" The questions came out almost automatically, driven by a curiosity he couldn't explain. Mrs. Irene hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable exposing her financial situation to her boss. "Yes, sir, I'm taking them. I managed to buy them with this month's meal voucher money." It was at this moment that Julia returned to the room, carefully carrying a glass of orange juice. Her face showed absolute concentration not to spill anything. "I made juice for you, sir," she said proudly, extending the glass to Anthony. "It's from the oranges our neighbor, Mrs. Zulmira, gave us." Anthony accepted the juice, touched by the gesture. He watched as Julia immediately sat next to her mother on the bed, as if to protect her. "Your mother told me she has pneumonia," he said, addressing Julia as he took a sip of the juice, "and that she's taking medicine to get better." Julia nodded seriously. "Yes, but it's very expensive medicine. The lady at the pharmacy said it cost almost all of my mum's salary." Mrs. Irene seemed embarrassed by her daughter's frankness, but Anthony realized something important at that moment. Julia's absolute sincerity, without filters or dissimulations, was something he hadn't encountered in his world for a long time. "Julia," he continued, placing the glass on a small table, "why did you go to work in your mother's place today?" The girl looked at him as if the answer was obvious. "Because if she loses her job, we won't have money for medicine, for rent, and for food. And Mrs. Regina always says you don't like it when people miss work." The simplicity of that childish logic struck Anthony like a blow. A 6-year-old child perfectly understood the economic consequences they would face and was willing to take on a role that wasn't hers to protect her mother and ensure both their survival. Looking at Mrs. Irene, now with new eyes, Anthony asked, "Do you have other family members who can help?" She shook her head. "No, sir. It's just Julia and me since her father left us when she was 2 years old. My parents have passed away, and my only brother lives out of state, also struggling." The word "passed away" was clearly used to avoid directly mentioning the loss in front of the child, and Anthony understood the delicacy. A silence settled in the room, interrupted only by Mrs. Irene's labored breathing. Anthony found himself at an emotional crossroads he hadn't experienced in years. Something in that house, in that sick mother, in that brave child, was stirring internal structures he thought had been solidified by time and success. "Mrs. Irene Mon," he finally said, making a decision that surprised even himself. "Don't worry about the job. Stay home as long as you need to recover completely." The relief on the woman's face was visible, but Anthony noticed there was also apprehension. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I promise I'll try my best to return as soon as possible." Anthony made a gesture for her not to worry about that now. Then, taking out his wallet, he withdrew several $1,000s and placed them on the dresser next to the bed. "This should be enough for the medications and expenses while you're recovering," he said, in a tone that admitted no refusal. "Consider it an advance on your salary." Mrs. Irene's eyes filled with tears, and she seemed unable to respond. It was Julia who broke the silence, looking at the money with childish astonishment. "Wow, so much money. We can buy all the medicine at the pharmacy." Anthony couldn't help but smile, something rare on his usually serious face. Julia's reaction was a reminder of how different the world seemed through a child's eyes. "You don't need to buy all the medicine at the pharmacy," he replied, feeling strangely light. "Just the ones your mother needs to get well." At that moment, observing the gratitude on Mrs. Irene's face and Julia's innocent joy, Anthony felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the sensation of having done something genuinely good, without expectation of return or personal gain. "I have a suggestion," he said, surprising himself again. "I know a doctor who specializes in pneumonia. I'll call him and ask him to come examine you here." Mrs. Irene seemed startled by the proposal. "Mr. Miller, I can't accept that. A private doctor must be very expensive, and you're already being too generous." "He owes me a few favors," Anthony replied naturally, though he actually intended to pay for the consultation. "And besides, the faster you recover, the better for everyone, isn't it?" Julia clapped her hands, delighted with the idea. "A doctor is coming to our house? Like in the movies." The innocent comment brought a smile to both Anthony and Mrs. Irene, creating an unexpected moment of complicity between them. As he said goodbye, Anthony promised to return the next day with the doctor. At the door of the house, Julia insisted on giving him a thank you hug, a gesture that caught him completely off guard. For an instant, he didn't know how to react, but then awkwardly he returned the hug. "Thank you, sir," she said, looking up with those huge, sincere eyes. "Mrs. Regina said you were very strict, but I knew you were good." Those simple words touched Anthony in a way he didn't expect. On the way back, in his luxury car crossing the city, he wondered when was the last time someone had called him good. Not successful, not intelligent, not visionary, but simply good. In his apartment that night, Anthony couldn't follow his usual routine. Normally he would work late, reviewing reports and planning the next day. But something had changed. He found himself looking out the window, observing the illuminated city, thinking about Mrs. Irene and Julia. As promised, the next day, he brought Dr. Paul Mason, one of New York City's most respected pulmonologists and his personal physician, to the house in East Queens. The specialist examined Mrs. Irene in detail and prescribed more effective medications, as well as additional tests that Anthony offered to pay for. "The situation is serious, but with proper treatment and absolute rest, she should recover in a few weeks," the doctor informed him, as they both drank coffee in the kitchen after the consultation. Julia, who was watching the doctor with fascination, asked with her usual frankness, "Are you really going to cure my mom?" Dr. Paul smiled at her. "I'll do my best, and your mom will help by resting and taking all her medicine." Anthony observed the interaction, feeling strangely connected to that small family and their problems. It was a new feeling for him, who had spent the last years avoiding any kind of emotional involvement. In the weeks that followed, to the surprise of everyone at the company and himself, Anthony regularly visited Mrs. Irene's house. At first, he justified it to himself as merely checking on his employee's recovery, ensuring she would return to work as quickly as possible. But over time, these justifications became less and less convincing, even to him. The truth, which he was reluctant to admit, was that those visits had become important to him. Seeing the progress in Mrs. Irene's health gave him a satisfaction different from any business deal closing. And conversations with Julia, with her infinite curiosity and disconcerting sincerity, were like a window into a world he had forgotten existed. On one of these visits, about 2 weeks after their first meeting, Anthony arrived carrying a small wrapped package. Mrs. Irene, already visibly better, was sitting in the living room. "It's for Julia," he explained, a little embarrassed, handing the package to her mother. Mrs. Irene seemed surprised. "You didn't have to. You've already done so much for us." "It's nothing much," he replied, trying to sound casual. "Just a book I saw in a bookstore and thought she might like." At that moment, Julia ran into the room, returning from school. Her eyes lit up when she saw Anthony, and she ran to hug him, a gesture he now received naturally, though he still felt a strange emotion every time it happened. "Mr. Anthony, you came to see us again," she exclaimed happily. "Yes, and I brought something for you," he replied, indicating the package in Mrs. Irene's hands. With typical childish excitement, Julia quickly opened the wrapping. It was an illustrated edition of The Little Prince, with colorful drawings and a hardcover. "A new book," she exclaimed, leafing through the pages with reverent care. "It's so beautiful." "Your teacher at school told me you really like to read," Anthony commented, feeling strangely nervous as if Julia's approval was important to him. "I love it, but I only have the school library books," she replied, hugging the book to her chest. "Now I have a book all my own." "Thank you, Mr. Anthony." Julia's genuine joy for something as simple as a book made Anthony reflect on his own relationship with material possessions. He who could buy practically anything he desired rarely felt the pure joy he saw in that child's eyes. That afternoon, at Julia's request, Anthony stayed for a snack. Sitting at the kitchen table, the three shared cheese bread made by Mrs. Irene and passion fruit juice. The simplicity of that moment contrasted sharply with the business dinners in Michelin-starred restaurants Anthony was accustomed to. "You never talk about your family," Julia commented, as she nibbled on a piece of cheese bread. "Do you have children?" The innocent question caught Anthony off guard. Mrs. Irene seemed embarrassed by her daughter's frankness, but he made a gesture to indicate he didn't mind. "No, Julia, I don't have children," he replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Nor a wife, nor close family. My parents are no longer here, and I never had siblings." Julia looked at him with a mixture of surprise and pity that only a child can express with such sincerity. "You live alone? Aren't you sad?" "Julia!" Mrs. Irene chided, embarrassed. "Don't ask such personal questions." But Anthony, surprisingly, didn't feel bothered. In fact, the question made him reflect. "I have staff who take care of the house," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "And I'm always busy with work, so I don't have much time to feel lonely." The word came out with difficulty, as if he was admitting something to himself for the first time. Julia nodded thoughtfully, as if processing very complex information. Then, with the disconcerting simplicity of children, she concluded, "But everyone needs someone to hug and tell stories to before bed. Even adults." Anthony felt something clench in his chest. The observation, so simple yet so profound, caught him completely off guard. He didn't know what to answer, so he just smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That afternoon at Mrs. Irene's house marked something important in Anthony's life. Upon returning to his luxurious and empty apartment, he felt strangely out of place, as if he were entering a stranger's house. For the first time in years, the silence and solitude of his life deeply bothered him. At the company, people began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. He remained demanding and focused, but something in his tone had softened. Summary dismissals for minor errors had ceased, and occasionally, employees would catch him lost in thought, looking out the window with an expression no one could decipher. A month passed since Anthony's first encounter with Julia. Mrs. Irene was almost completely recovered, thanks to proper treatment and constant follow-up by Dr. Paul. Soon she would be able to return to work, which meant Anthony would no longer have justifications for his regular visits to that small house in East Queens. This thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit. During those weeks, his visits had become an unexpected refuge from the pressures and coldness of the corporate world. There, in that simple but welcoming environment, he experienced something he had forgotten existed, the feeling of being welcome, not for what he possessed or the power he wielded, but simply for who he was. One Saturday afternoon, Anthony arrived at Mrs. Irene's house with a carefully crafted proposal. "I have an idea for you two," he announced, as the three sat in the living room. "Now that Mrs. Irene is better, I thought we could celebrate with an outing tomorrow. We could go to Central Park, have a picnic." Julia's eyes widened with excitement. "A real picnic? With a blanket on the ground and everything?" "Exactly," Anthony confirmed, caught up in the girl's enthusiasm. "With a blanket on the ground, special food, and maybe even a paddle boat ride on the lake." Mrs. Irene seemed hesitant. "Mr. Miller, you've already done so much for us. You don't need to bother with this." Anthony realized that, despite all the weeks of companionship, Mrs. Irene still maintained a certain reserve with him, a distant respect that in a way bothered him. He wanted her to see him not just as her boss, but as someone who genuinely cared. "It's no bother at all," he replied sincerely. "In fact, it would be important to me." He hesitated, unaccustomed to expressing feelings. "I've been thinking a lot about Julia's words, about everyone needing company. I think she's right." Mrs. Irene looked at him with an expression Anthony couldn't quite decipher. There was surprise, but also something more, perhaps understanding. "Besides," he continued, trying to sound more practical, "it will be good for you too. Mrs. Irene, a little fresh air and light exercise will help with your full recovery, according to Dr. Paul." "Please, Mom," Julia pleaded, jumping on the sofa. "I've never been to Central Park. Mariana from my class said there are ducks and huge trees there." Faced with her daughter's enthusiasm and Anthony's sincerity, Mrs. Irene finally relented. "All right, we accept the invitation." "Thank you, Mr. Miller." "Anthony," he corrected, feeling it was time to break down some barriers. "Please call me Anthony." Sunday dawned with a perfect blue sky, as if nature conspired to make the outing even more special. Anthony arrived early, driving his own car, a luxurious sedan he rarely used, preferring to be chauffeured most of the time. Julia was ready, dressed in her best dress and with her hair carefully braided. The excitement on her face was contagious. Mrs. Irene, though more restrained, also seemed happy about the outing. Central Park was crowded, as it always was on sunny Sundays in New York City. Families spread across the lawns, children running, couples walking hand in hand, groups of friends playing ball. Anthony, accustomed to controlled and exclusive environments, felt momentarily out of place in that scene of collective, carefree joy. But Julia's enthusiasm soon enveloped him. "Look at all the puppies!" she exclaimed, pointing everywhere. "And there's a giant tree over there. Can I go see it up close?" Anthony exchanged a look with Mrs. Irene, who nodded with a smile. "Go, but don't go out of our sight," she advised. While Julia ran across the lawn, exploring every detail of the park with a child's infinite curiosity, Anthony and Mrs. Irene spread a blanket under a leafy tree and organized the picnic he had arranged through a catering service. "This is different from what I imagined," Mrs. Irene commented, looking at the sophisticated containers holding elaborate salads, gourmet sandwiches, exotic fruits cut into decorative shapes, and a bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling cider. Anthony smiled, realizing he might have overdone it a bit. "Sorry, I guess I got carried away. I've never had a picnic before." The confession caught Mrs. Irene by surprise. "Never? Not even when you were a child?" Anthony shook his head, feeling suddenly vulnerable, revealing that detail of his life. "My parents were very busy. My father was a small business owner, always working. My mother, well, she had her own problems." There was much more to that story than he was revealing, but he didn't feel ready to share everything. How to explain a childhood marked by emotional absence, by impossible standards to meet, by the constant feeling of never being enough? How to talk about a father who measured people's worth solely by material success, or a mother who sought solace in alcohol to cope with her husband's coldness? These were old wounds Anthony had buried under layers of success and self-discipline. Julia ran back, interrupting the moment of reflection. "There's a man making giant soap bubbles near the lake. Can we go see?" The rest of the day unfolded at a pace Anthony was unaccustomed to, slow, carefree, dictated by small pleasures and discoveries. They rowed a paddle boat on the lake, watched street performers, bought cotton candy for Julia, and simply enjoyed the feeling of being outdoors, without commitments or expectations. For Anthony, every moment was a rediscovery. The sweet taste of cotton candy, which he hadn't eaten since childhood. The feeling of the sun on his face, without the worry of schedules or meetings. The simplicity of watching ducks swim in the lake, with Julia excitedly pointing to every movement of the birds. But above all, what touched him most was the interaction between mother and daughter. The way Mrs. Irene, or Joanna, as he had started to call her after much insistence, cared for Julia with a perfect blend of protection and freedom. The way she answered every one of her daughter's questions with infinite patience. The small gestures of affection, a kiss on the forehead, a spontaneous hug, an exchange of knowing smiles. It was a type of relationship he had never experienced, neither as a child nor in any other aspect of his adult life. Observing the two, Anthony felt a complex mix of emotions, admiration, envy, and a deep desire to be part of it somehow. "What are you thinking about?" Joanna asked, when they finally managed to get Julia to sit down and eat something. The question caught Anthony off guard. He wasn't used to sharing his thoughts, especially the more vulnerable ones. "I'm thinking that you two have something very special," he replied, opting for honesty. "Something no money can buy." Joanna nodded, understanding the depth of those simple words. "It wasn't easy, you know. After Julia's father abandoned us, there were days when I didn't know how we would survive. But somehow we always kept going. She is my strength." "You never heard from him again?" Anthony asked, curious about the full story of that family. Joanna shook her head. "He met another woman, younger. Said he wasn't ready to be a father, that life wasn't for him. He promised to send money but never did. After some time, I heard he moved to another state. He never tried to make contact again." The anger Anthony felt for this unknown man surprised him by its intensity. How could someone abandon a child, his own daughter? How could he give up the chance to see Julia grow up, to hear her curious questions, to receive her spontaneous hugs? He doesn't know what he missed, he finally said, looking at Julia, who was now trying to feed a bold duck that had approached the group. No, Joanna agreed, with a mixture of sadness and resignation in her voice. But Julia never seemed to miss him, you know. She was very little when he left. Sometimes she asks about her father, and I say he's far away. One day when she's older, I'll tell her the whole truth. But for now, I protect her as best I can. At that moment, something solidified within Anthony, a feeling that had been growing over those weeks, but now took a clear and defined form. He wanted to be part of the lives of these two people. He wanted to protect them, care for them, ensure they never again experienced need or suffering. And it wasn't just out of generosity or compassion. It was out of a deeply selfish desire to experience the joy and love that radiated from them. The sun began to set when they decided it was time to go back. Julia, exhausted after a day of adventures, fell asleep in the back seat of the car before they even left the parking lot. In the silence of the journey, with the city slowly lighting up as dusk fell, Anthony felt himself gathering courage to express something he never imagined he would say. "Joanna," he began, hesitantly keeping his eyes on the road, "I've been thinking a lot about you two, about how our lives crossed in such an unexpected way, and about how everything seems different now." She watched him attentively without interrupting, letting him find the right words. "Before I met you, I thought I had everything that was important. Success, money, recognition, but now I realize I was just existing. I wasn't really living." He paused, gathering courage. "You showed me something different, something I didn't even know I was looking for." "Anthony," Joanna said softly, "you don't have to—" "I do," he interrupted, feeling that if he didn't express it now, he might never gather the courage again. "I need you to know that I want to help you. Not just financially, as I have been, but in every possible way. I want to be part of your lives, if you'll let me." A silence settled in the car, filled only by Julia's soft breathing as she slept. Anthony felt his heart pounding, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his youth. "Are you sure about this?" Joanna finally asked. "Our life is very different from yours. We are simple people with simple problems. Your world is another. What if I don't want that world anymore? What if I realize it's empty, compared to what I found with you two?" The sincerity of that confession surprised them both. Anthony had never expressed his feelings so openly, not even to himself. Joanna didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was laden with contained emotion. "I think we need time, Anthony. All of this happened very quickly. A few weeks ago, you were just my boss, someone I feared. Now," she hesitated, "now you are important to us, especially to Julia, but big changes require reflection." Anthony nodded, respecting her caution. Deep down, he knew Joanna was right. What he was proposing, though he hadn't yet put it into exact words, was a complete transformation of all their lives. It wasn't something that should be decided on the impulse of a happy day. "You're right," he agreed, stopping the car in front of their house. "We'll give it time. But I want you to know that I'm serious. I've never been so sure of anything in my life." The look Joanna gave him contained a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. There was gratitude, yes, but also apprehension, and perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of something deeper. The following week, something unusual happened at Miller Holdings. To the surprise of all employees, especially those who had worked at the company for a long time, Anthony announced a series of changes in human resources policies, an increase in the health plan to include dependents, implementation of an education program for employees' children, flexible working hours for parents, and the creation of a daycare center within the company. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" Regina, his secretary, asked after the meeting where he presented these changes to the board. The question, though asked in a teasing tone, contained genuine concern. Anthony smiled, a gesture that was now becoming increasingly frequent on his previously serious face. "I've never been better, Regina. In fact, I'm starting to see things I didn't see before." The changes were not limited to the professional environment. In his luxurious apartment, Anthony began to make alterations that surprised his housekeeper. He replaced some modern and impersonal furniture with cozier pieces, added plants to various rooms, and even framed a drawing Julia had made for him, a colorful and clumsy representation of 3 figures holding hands. A large one, him, a medium one, Joanna, and a small one, her. He also began to explore New York City in a way he had never done before. Guided by Joanna's suggestions, he visited parks, museums, simple but welcoming restaurants, and even a farmer's market on Sunday, an experience that left him simultaneously fascinated and out of place. It was as if he was rediscovering his own city, seeing it through new eyes. Places he had always considered too noisy or disorganized now revealed a charm of their own, a vitality that was lacking in the aseptic and exclusive environments he used to frequent. In one of these explorations, he found a small bookstore specializing in children's literature. He got lost for hours among the colorful shelves, carefully selecting books he thought Julia might like. He left carrying a heavy bag, feeling strangely light. His visits to Joanna and Julia's house became even more frequent. Now there was no longer the justification of illness. Joanna had even returned to work, albeit in a new administrative role that Anthony had created especially for her. There was only the genuine desire to be with them, to be part of that small nucleus that in some way had become his emotional refuge. On one of these visits, while they were having dinner together, Julia asked one of those disconcertingly direct questions that only children can formulate. "Mr. Anthony, are you going to be my new dad?" The silence that followed was thick. Joanna looked mortified, caught between shame and fear of how Anthony would react. But he, after the initial surprise, felt an intense emotion run through his body. It was as if Julia, with her innocence, had given voice to the deepest desire he had not yet been able to fully express. "Julia, that's not something you just ask," Joanna gently chided. "Mr. Anthony is our friend. But he always comes here, brings presents, takes us out, just like Mariana's dad does with her and her mum," Julia argued, with the irrefutable logic of children. "And you smile differently when he's here, Mom. Your smile gets bigger." Joanna blushed intensely while Anthony felt his heart quicken. Was it true? Did she smile differently when he was around? And more importantly, what should he answer Julia? Opting for honesty, he knelt down to be at the girl's height and said with all the sincerity he could muster, "Julia, I like you and your mom very much. You are very important to me. As for being your dad, well, that depends on many things. It's a very serious decision that adults need to make together. But regardless, I want you to know that I will always be here for you whenever you need me." The girl's eyes lit up, satisfied with the answer. For her, the logic was simple. If he liked them and they liked him, the next natural step was to form a family. Later, after Julia had gone to sleep, Anthony and Joanna sat on the small porch of the house, sharing a moment of comfortable silence. The night was pleasant, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of jasmine planted in the neighbor's garden. "Sorry about Julia's question," Joanna finally said. "She's very direct sometimes." "Don't apologize," Anthony replied. "In fact, I think she just expressed aloud what I've been thinking for weeks." Joanna looked at him with surprise, and he realized it was time to fully open his heart. "Joanna, I don't know exactly how or when it happened, but you two changed my life. Before I thought I knew what success was, what was important. I lived for work, for numbers, for material achievements. But now," he paused, searching for the right words, "now I realize I was just surviving, not truly living. You showed me what's really important. Connection. Affection, family." Joanna listened attentively, her eyes reflecting the soft light from the living room. "I know everything happened very quickly," he continued. "I know I come from a different world than yours, that perhaps there are reasons for you to doubt. But I need you to know that my feelings are genuine. I fell in love with you, Joanna, and with Julia too, in a different but equally profound way. You became the family I never had, that I never thought I could have." The words came out more fluidly than he expected, as if they had merely been waiting for the opportunity to be released. Now they were there, hanging in the night air, vulnerable and true. Joanna didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was laden with emotion. "Anthony, I've also developed feelings for you. How could I not? You came into our lives in the most unexpected way and transformed everything. But," she hesitated, "I'm scared." "Scared of what?" he asked gently, scared to believe again. Scared that one day you'll realize this isn't your world, that you'll miss your old life, with all the glamour and possibilities it offered. We are simple people, Anthony. I'm afraid that one day this won't be enough for you anymore. Anthony took Joanna's hands in his, feeling the texture of skin that told stories of hard work and constant care. Joanna, I understand your fear. It's legitimate, considering everything you've been through. He took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. But I need you to understand something. That life I had, which seemed so glamorous from the outside, was empty. It was a solitary existence, based on accumulation and competition. What I discovered with you, this feeling of belonging, of purpose, of connection, is infinitely more valuable. He saw hesitation in her eyes, an internal battle between hope and fear. I'm not asking you to make a decision now, he continued. I'm just asking you to give me the chance to prove with actions and not just words that my feelings are true and lasting. We can go slowly at your pace. What matters is that we are together on this journey. Joanna nodded slightly, a small smile beginning to form on her lips. I think we can try, she finally said, step by step. That night, returning to his apartment, Anthony felt lighter than he had in years. It was as if an enormous weight had been removed from his shoulders, the weight of expectations, appearances, the emotional armor he had built over decades. For the first time in a long time, he saw a future that was not based solely on professional achievements and accumulation of wealth, but on genuine human connections. The weeks that followed were filled with discoveries and adjustments for the three of them. Anthony and Joanna began to build a relationship that, although born in unusual circumstances, revealed itself to be more solid and true each day. Julia flourished with his presence, finding in the man who was once so serious and distant an inexhaustible source of patience, affection, and encouragement. However, not everything was perfect. The contrast between Anthony's and Joanna's worlds occasionally created mismatches and insecurities. He needed to learn to live more simply, to value experiences he would once have considered mundane. She, in turn, felt intimidated by the sophisticated environments that were part of his life, afraid of not fitting in or of being judged. But each obstacle overcome further strengthened the bond between them. The differences, instead of separating them, complemented each other, creating a rich and balanced dynamic. On a Sunday afternoon, about 3 months after the Central Park outing, Anthony surprised Joanna and Julia with an unexpected proposal. I'd like to take you to see my home, he said, as they walked in a park near their house. I mean, my apartment. I never invited you before because, well, I guess I was afraid you'd see how I lived and realize how cold and empty my life was. Joanna smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. We're curious, it's true. Julia always asks what your place is like. Is it giant like a castle? The girl asked, skipping beside them. Does it have a pool? And a cinema? And a room full of toys? Anthony laughed, delighted by her imagination. It's not exactly a castle, but it's a spacious place. It has a beautiful view of the city. And as for toys, well, maybe we can provide some. On the agreed day, Anthony's driver picked up Joanna and Julia at home. The girl could barely contain her excitement, while her mother tried to hide her nervousness. Both wore their best clothes, Julia in a new dress Anthony had given her, Joanna in a simple but elegant outfit. The building where Anthony lived was imposing, in the Park Avenue neighborhood. The doorman greeted them with deference, and the exclusive elevator took them directly to the penthouse. When the doors opened, they revealed a spacious and elegant apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of New York City. Julia immediately ran to the balcony, marveling at the possibility of seeing the entire city at her feet. Joanna, however, seemed intimidated by the grandeur of the place. It's very impressive, she commented, observing the designer furniture, the artworks on the walls, the impeccable organization of each room. Anthony noticed her discomfort. I know it seems cold and impersonal. It was like that until recently. But come, I want to show you something. He led her down a corridor to a closed door. Opening it, he revealed a room that contrasted sharply with the rest of the apartment. The walls, once white, were now painted in a soft shade of yellow. A bed with a colorful quilt occupied the center of the space, flanked by a bookshelf filled with children's books. In the corner, a small table with drawing and painting materials, and hanging on the main wall, carefully framed, was the drawing Julia had made of the three figures holding hands. "Is it for Julia?" Joanna asked, touched. Anthony nodded. "I wanted her to have a space here, a place that was just hers. I thought maybe you two could spend some weekends here now and then." He hesitated, afraid he was moving too fast. "Only if you want to, of course. No pressure." Joanna's eyes swept across the room, gently touching the objects, recognizing the care and affection invested in every detail. When she turned her gaze back to Anthony, there were suppressed tears. "You're really committed to this, aren't you?" "To us. More than I've ever been. To anything in my life," he replied with absolute sincerity. At that moment, Julia burst into the room, still euphoric from exploring the apartment. Upon seeing the room specially prepared for her, her reaction was one of pure joy. "It's mine? A room just for me in this castle?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. "Yes, it's yours," Anthony confirmed, feeling a wave of affection that almost overwhelmed him. "Whenever you and your mother want to stay here, this space will be waiting for you." The girl ran to hug him, one of those spontaneous and sincere hugs that had become her favorite way of showing affection. Joanna watched the scene with an emotional smile, as if finally allowing herself to believe that all of this was real and possible. The rest of the day was filled with discoveries and surprises. Anthony had prepared a special lunch with the help of his private chef, including Julia's favorite dishes. Afterwards, he showed them the condominium's pool, where they spent hours playing and swimming, laughing as if they had always been a family. That night, as Julia fell asleep in her new room, exhausted after a day of so many emotions, Anthony and Joanna talked on the balcony under the starry New York City sky. "Do you know what's most incredible about all this?" he commented, observing the city lights. "Before I'd look at this view and only see buildings, cars, the urban hustle. Now I see possibilities, stories, connected lives. It's as if you and Julia have given me new lenses to see the world." Joanna rested her head on his shoulder in a gesture of intimacy that was still new to both of them. "You also changed our perspective, Anthony. You showed us that there is kindness and generosity even in the most unexpected places. That sometimes what seems like our worst moment can just be the beginning of something wonderful." That night, while Joanna slept in the guest room and Julia in her new space, Anthony remained awake for some time, reflecting on the improbable journey that had brought him there. How had something that began with irritation over an employee's absence transformed into the deepest and most significant connection of his life? The answer, he now realized, lay in the simplicity and sincerity that Joanna and Julia brought to his excessively calculated and controlled world. They had reminded him of what it is to be human, with all the vulnerabilities and joys that entails. In the months that followed, the relationship between the three deepened and solidified. Anthony and Joanna built day after day a partnership based on mutual respect, admiration, and a love that grew steadily and securely. Julia blossomed with his presence, finding in the man who was once so serious and distant an inexhaustible source of patience, affection, and encouragement. At the company, the changes initiated by Anthony expanded and deepened. Miller Holdings continued to be an example of excellence and success in the market, but now also stood out for its humanized policies and its commitment to employee well-being. The daycare center installed in the building became a benchmark, and the education program for employees' children won social responsibility awards. Regina, his loyal secretary, commented on one occasion, "You know, Mr. Miller, I've worked with you for over 15 years, and I've never seen you so happy. It's as if you've finally found a balance." Anthony smiled, recognizing the accuracy of the observation. "You're right, Regina. I think I needed to lose something I considered fundamental, my obsession with control and success at all costs, to gain something infinitely more valuable." One Saturday afternoon, almost a year after his first meeting with Julia, Anthony took Joanna for a walk in Bryant Park, a green oasis in the heart of Fifth Avenue. The place held a special significance for him. It was where his parents occasionally took him as a child, in the rare moments when his father disconnected from work and his mother was sober enough to leave the house. Walking along the shaded paths, hand in hand, Anthony shared these memories with Joanna, something he rarely did, preferring not to revisit his past. But now, strengthened by the love they had built, he felt capable of looking at those experiences with new eyes, understanding how they had shaped who he was and the choices he had made throughout his life. I think I spent so much time trying to be different from my father that I ended up becoming like him in the wrong ways, he reflected. I adopted the same obsession with work, the same coldness in relationships. The difference is that he had my mother and me by his side, even if he didn't value us adequately. I chose complete solitude. Joanna squeezed his hand in a gesture of silent support. She had learned to recognize when he just needed to be heard, without the need for advice or comments. But then Julia appeared in that hallway, with those huge gloves and that impressive determination. He continued, a smile forming as he remembered. And everything changed. It's as if she opened a door inside me that I didn't even know was locked. They stopped under a leafy tree, whose branches formed a natural canopy over a wooden bench. Anthony guided Joanna to sit down, feeling his heart race with anticipation of what he was about to do. Joanna, he began, turning to face her directly. This year with you and Julia has been the most significant of my life. You taught me what's truly important, showed me a kind of happiness I didn't even know existed. She smiled, her eyes sparkling with contained emotion. It was transformative for us too, Anthony. You brought security, stability, but most importantly, you brought love in a way I never imagined I'd find again. Anthony took a deep breath, gathering his courage. Then, to Joanna's surprise, he knelt before her, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. I know a year might seem like a short time to some people, but for me it was enough to be absolutely certain of what I want for the rest of my life. He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring with a single diamond. Joanna, would you do me the honor of marrying me, of officially forming the family we've already built in our hearts? Silent tears streamed down Joanna's face as she looked from the ring to the man kneeling before her, a man so different from the severe and distant boss she had known a year ago. Yes, she replied, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, Anthony, I want to marry you. When he slid the ring onto her finger and stood to embrace her, both felt that moment sealed, not only a commitment between two people, but the culmination of a journey of profound transformation and the beginning of a new phase in their lives. On the way back, Anthony paused in front of a toy store. I think we have one more person to ask an important question, he commented with a knowing smile. Inside the store, they carefully chose a small children's ring with a colorful, sparkling stone. Julia, who had been with a friend's grandmother during the couple's outing, could not contain her excitement when they arrived to pick her up. We have a surprise for you, Anthony announced after they explained about the engagement. Julia looked curious as he knelt before her, exactly as he had done with Joanna earlier. Julia, he began, feeling a different, equally intense emotion, when I marry your mother, I would like to officially adopt you as my daughter. This means I would be your father not just in heart, as I already am, but also in the eyes of the law. What do you think? The girl's eyes widened, processing the information. Then, to Anthony and Joanna's delight, a huge smile lit up her face. I'd have a real dad? And I could call you Dad? Yes to both questions, Anthony confirmed, presenting the small ring. Julia didn't hesitate for a second. She extended her left hand, imitating the gesture she had seen her mother make when she proudly showed off her own ring. After Anthony placed the ring on her finger, she threw herself into his arms in one of those spontaneous hugs that had become her trademark. Thank you, Dad, she whispered in his ear, using the word for the first time. At that moment, with Julia in his arms and Joanna watching the scene with tears of happiness, Anthony Miller knew with absolute certainty that he had found the true meaning of success. It wasn't in the numbers in his bank account, nor in the awards on his wall, nor in the fearful respect of his employees. It was there in the capacity to love and be loved, in the courage to allow himself to be transformed by the kindness and sincerity he had found in the most unexpected people. The wedding was celebrated 3 months later, in an intimate ceremony in the garden of a boutique hotel. The guest list was small, only Joanna's close friends and a few colleagues with whom Anthony had developed more significant relationships after his transformation. Regina, his secretary, was one of the bridesmaids. To general surprise, but not to those who knew the fundamental role she had played in the events that united that improbable family. Julia, radiant in a bridesmaid dress specially designed for her, carried the rings with adorable seriousness. When it was time for the vows, Anthony surprised everyone by kneeling to speak directly to her, even before addressing his bride. "Julia, I promise to be the father you deserve. Present, loving, patient. I promise to support your dreams, respect your choices, and be by your side in all moments, good or difficult. Above all, I promise never to forget the most important lesson you taught me, that true strength lies in the courage to show who we truly are, without fear or disguises." There wasn't a dry eye among the guests when he stood to exchange vows with Joanna. The Rebins, words they shared were a testament to the extraordinary journey that had brought them together, a journey that began with a determined child helping her mother, and now culminated in the official formation of a family built on the most solid foundations: understanding, respect, and true love. After the ceremony, while the guests celebrated, Anthony found a moment of quiet with his new wife and daughter. The three sat on a bench under a flowering tree, watching the sunset. "I never imagined life could be like this," he commented, with Julia nestled in his lap and Joanna by his side. "So complete," Joanna smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "Sometimes the universe has plans for us that are far better than anything we could imagine." "Like when I went to work in my mum's place?" Julia asked, looking up with that infinite curiosity that was her trademark. "Exactly like that," Anthony confirmed, hugging her tighter. "That day, which could have been just another in my life, ended up being the beginning of everything that truly matters." The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The first stars began to appear timidly in the darkening sky. It was a new beginning for the three of them, not just as husband and wife, or as father and daughter, but as a family united by bonds that transcended blood or legal roles. Anthony Miller, the man who once believed that success was measured by material achievements and absolute control, had discovered a much deeper truth: that true wealth lies in the ability to open oneself to the unexpected, to allow oneself to be transformed by love, and to find purpose in genuine connection with other human beings. And it all began with a 6-year-old girl, determined not to let her mother lose her job, carrying a bucket almost her size through the corridors of a company where, until then, people like her were considered invisible and disposable. Life, Anthony had learned, has surprising ways of teaching us its most valuable lessons. And sometimes the greatest teachers come in the smallest and most unexpected packages. Dear listeners, we hope Anthony, Joanna, and Julia's story has touched your hearts. This narrative reminds us that true wealth is not in what we possess, but in the connections we build and the courage to allow love to transform our lives. For more emotional stories like this, we have prepared a special playlist that you can access by clicking on the link to the left of your screen. If this journey of transformation and redemption has touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to our channel, leave your like and share with those you love. Tell us in the comments which city you're watching from and what part of the story moved you the most. We'll be back tomorrow with another narrative that will inspire your days and warm your soul.